to this day, The Statue of Liberty is still my favorite film I've ever cut. And it was a great, wonderful experience. And when we were finishing that film, he said to me, I'm planning this history of the Civil War, and I'd love you to come back and work with me on it. And I said, Ken, anything you do, I will come back. Just call, I'll be there.
Welcome to another episode of The Filmosophers. I'm Dean Slider.
And I'm Chris Bush.
This is the podcast where we talk about films and filmosophy with the people who make films and the people who love films. Hopefully, sometimes people who love films and make them. Today's guest is the legendary documentary film editor, Paul Barnes. Paul is best known for his work of over 30 years with Ken Burns, but he also was the editor of the groundbreaking documentary The Thin Blue Line. He edited The Weavers, Pumping Iron 2, and many others. He has been a professor of film at New York University, and he is the mentor of generations, a couple of generations of young documentary editors. My personal connection is that my wife, Yafa Larea, is documentary film editor who came up as one of Paul's disciples and who first introduced me to him as the Buddha of the editing room. And I can testify that his Buddhahood extends not only to his art, but also to his way as a person and his way of being with other people. So welcome, Paul Barnes.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
So how did you wind up being an editor? How does this happen? And how did you wind up in documentary film?
Well, when I went to NYU, the way the program was structured is in sophomore year, the students were separated into crews, and then you had to rotate through the different jobs. So one time you were cinematographer, one time director, one time writer, one time producing, one time sound, and one time editing. And I just found that it was a great way for kids to kind of gravitate towards where their talents lie. And for me, it really was the editing room. I just found that putting all the pieces together that people had gone out and gathered was the most fun, because that's where you saw the film come to life. Out in the field in production, it's one problem after another. You have no idea if what you're getting is really good or not. It's just total chaos and craziness. And being a rather calm and unchaotic person myself, I'd rather see the bits of chaos coalesce into something that coheres into an actual vision. And so, that's where it just fell into my heart. And in junior year, what I decided to do was basically cut all of my friends' student films. I offered myself to everybody who seemed to have an interesting project. And then I basically lived in the editing room in my sophomore year, including cutting all my other classes, basically. And at the time, I was taking a wonderful editing class with an editor called Carl Lerner, who cut Clute with Jane Fonda and Donald Sutherland. Mm-hmm. And what he did in his class was he had a projector that could stop and start basically at every edit. And so he talked about every single cut he made through the course of that 2-hour film and all the decisions behind that. And I learned so many keys and tricks of the trade from Carl by going through that film shot by shot, cut by cut, with all of the problems that he had to fix. It was just an amazing, amazing class. And I would immediately after that class run back to my cutting room and start to apply what he was teaching me to what I was cutting on a student film. So the combination of the two was really what, created my skills. Besides, from there being largely self-taught and very intuitive about how editing works. So by the time I finished in sophomore year, I was pretty well grounded in the skills and craft of editing as a beginner for sure. So I was ready to go. Give me a professional job. I don't want to do senior year. Thank you very much. That actually happened.
Really, that's great. That's great. So what is What does the editor do? It sounds like such a basic, almost dumb question, but what I've found being married to one is that people don't understand. They think, oh, someone drops a movie on your desk and you sand it a little, you snip out the bloopers. And and I know that is just so wrong.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, it's really much more than that. It's basically, I mean, there's so many things involved. First of all, the biggest thing is the storyline. You've got a story to tell. And especially in the world of documentary, there's often not a script. My first experiences in cutting documentaries were that they were all cinema verite. They were all shot on the fly. There was a general idea of what the film was supposed to be and the characters, but you'd follow them around and the story would kind of start to emerge from the material. But there was no kind of beginning, middle, and end to it. And so you have to discover what the story is, in the material that was being gathered by the documentary director. Then it's a question of wanting to realize the vision of the director. The director always starts, with some idea of why he was making the film to begin with. So I talk with the director extensively to kind of get inside their head. Why are you making this film? What is it about? What does it mean to you? What's the themes? What do you want to come out? What do you want to present to the audience? And so again, as an editor, I try to realize that vision. Then you're dealing with problem solving on a kind of massive scale. Shots that don't work, scenes that don't work. You go through all of the material and figure out what is the best stuff. What is the material that's really working? Where is the emotion really coming through from the characters? Where is the story really being told? And so you start to whittle away all of what I call the deadwood and get down to all of the bits and pieces that really do fit the character and the storylines and the themes. And then you figure out how to make those cohere into something that's has a nice through line story-wise and an emotional richness to it, so that the characters are coming through and the meaning of what the director is trying to achieve is coming through. And that's a question of pacing and momentum. It's, film has a movement to it and you don't ever want it to go dead. You have to keep the momentum going. And so how do you snip away at material to keep the momentum and the pacing going to the point where it's something new is being delivered to the audience at every shot, and there's a good change at every moment, so that you keep the interest of the audience going and don't let the film ever go slack. So there is, in some ways, it's almost like conducting a composition in a way. I mean, there's a kind of analogy to that as a conductor, conducting a score by a composer. The same kind of thing applies in terms of applying that rhythm to a film. So it's all of those things, and then you start to think about in terms of pacing of how do you speed things up, to give it a momentum, and then when do you hit those moments where it's emotionally so important that you actually want to slow down a little bit, so that emotion really settles in on the audience. So it is a real question of balance of how do you weave all the pieces together in a really very pleasing, cohesive whole to tell a story and to have the emotion come through. And then it's a question of playing around with music and how music can be applied to help the elements of story, to help the pacing. Sound effects, how do sound effects apply to that? To add to all of the layers of richness that are going into the creation of the film. It's really quite complex. I mean, it's, working with Ken, we would sit back sometimes exhausted and just go, there's just a billion goddamn decisions we have to make constantly, to get through one scene, let alone a whole 2-hour film. But it's fascinating and wonderful to watch all these things, cohere into something that works, for the audience. And I always feel as editors, I'm kind of a surrogate for the audience. I'm the first audience in a way. It's like, what do I want to see? What do I want to feel? What do I want to hear? How do I want to be affected by this? And so the decisions that I'm making in conjunction with the director, I'm always thinking about the audience and how the audience is going to receive this in the end. And will it come across the way the director intended, from the get-go when he first planned the film?
Does the director always really know what he's looking for, or is it more of a process of discovery that perhaps the editor is facilitating?
It is in some ways a process of discovery. I mean, it's a good way of putting it, Dean. There are a lot of, especially documentary filmmakers, who don't really know how to edit. They don't know how to, they haven't learned the skill, they haven't learned the craft. And so they really get very anxious because it's like, I'm gathering all of these bits and pieces, and I don't know what I have. And it's true, they don't. So my role is to step in and kind of help to guide them through their material and make it work as a whole. I mean, there are some directors who do know how to edit. Ken was a very good editor on his own. It was wonderful to work with him because a part of my job, got separated because he knew how to edit and put the story together, and I could sort of let that part go and do more of the fun parts, the rhythm parts and the visual parts and the effects parts and music parts, and not have to worry so much about story and character because he was on top of it, like a crazy man. So every once in a while you hit, but like with Erroll Morris and the Thimble Line, it was the opposite. Erroll did not have a clue about how to edit. And so working with him was like pulling teeth in some ways because he had a bit of ADHD, and when you're editing, you have to really concentrate, and trying to get Erroll to concentrate on helping me put something together was often a losing battle. So it goes both ways, and in that case, then I am in some ways becoming a little bit more of the writer of the film as well as the editor, and trying to get the characters and the storyline to coalesce. But it's always in conjunction with who you're working with. I mean, if Erroll didn't like something I put together, he would say so, and we would start to change it. And often if I put something together that didn't work for him, that would be a key element to get him to work because he wasn't happy. So it's like, okay, well, what do you want? What do you want to see here? What do you want to do? Where do you want to go? What do you want them to say? What do you want to see? Then I could get him to concentrate more, and then we could work together on improving it and making it what he wanted it to be.
Let's talk about The Thin Blue Line. And first of all, for anyone who has not seen it, please run out and see it. You can get it from Amazon Prime, and sit down and watch it tonight.
The Thimble Line, which was directed by Erroll Morris, is basically the story of a killing of a policeman in Dallas, Texas. And the man who was accused of the crime and tried and convicted of the crime, Randall Adams, spent 11 years in jail for a crime that he did not commit. And the crime was actually committed by a young man who helped him get some gas when he ran out of gas on a road in Dallas, David Harris. And they spent the rest of the day together. And that evening, after Randall got dropped off at his motel, David was driving out of town back home, and he was stopped by a policeman, and David was the one who shot the cop. And he drove off, leaving the cop in the street. And then as the police were narrowing in on the killer, they interviewed David, and David just accused Randall. And the police believed David, and they didn't believe Randall. And Randall wound up in jail for 11 years for a crime he didn't commit. And in the course of investigating murders in Texas, Erroll uncovered this story, and the more he read into the story and the transcripts of the trial, he realized how Randall was being railroaded by the DA, and he was determined to help get Randall out of jail.
And I think it's fair to say that it really changed the whole idea of what a documentary film can be.
Yeah, for good and bad. I have to say.
Okay.
One thing that, I mean, when we did the film, which was in I'm trying to think back, I think it was 1986, 87, that we did the Thimble Line. Back in those days, the idea of recreations in documentaries was anathema. There was this kind of purist cult in the documentary world that you could not do recreations. And if you did do them, they were so cheesy and so cheap that, any semblance to reality went out the window. So you weren't really making a documentary. The same thing applied to using voiceover and narration as well. I mean, it was just this rigid way of looking at documentary that was a little bit, nuts in a way. To me, when you make a film, there's all kinds of rules that are meant to be broken. And I think all of the innovators in film are always breaking rules constantly to advance the art.
And in fact, there was a controversy where The Thin Blue Line was not nominated for an Oscar for Best Documentary because it broke too many rules.
Yeah, it was exactly that. And some of the people on the documentary committee actually thought that the people in the film were actors and the interviews were scripted.
Really?
It went that far. Yes.
Wow.
It was pretty crazy. I know.
That's crazy.
Yeah. But so when Erroll approached me to do the film, he said, I want to do recreations. And I said, and I talked to him about it. I said, Erroll, you're going to get ripped to shreds in the documentary world. He said, I don't care. I don't care about those guys. It's like, this is what has to be done. I'm making a film about lies, he said. And I want to illustrate those lies by having every recreation different. Mm-hmm. I want to recreate the lie and then have the audience separate out the truth. And I thought, this is interesting. This is an interesting and different way to approach recreations. It's like you're recreating lies. Mm-hmm. And then he said, I want them to be very stylized. I want them to be very theatrical. I don't want them to look like a semblance of reality. I don't want to see, the murder as if it was shot in a Sidney Lumet film, with real locations and blood and squibs and all that stuff. He said, I don't want to do that. I want it to be very theatrical. And again, that intrigued me, and I thought, well, okay, this is a different thing. Let's, and then he had a little trailer made of the policewoman's involvement in the case. And he had done some recreations in 16 millimeter. He wasn't happy with them, but they were pretty good. They weren't perfect. And he was planning to go back and shoot them again in 35 with a better cinematographer, which I was happy to hear about because the 16 weren't that good. But the trailer was very, very effective in the way he did it. And he had Philip Glass on the score, which was wonderfully effective. And the combination of the interviews with these stylized recreations and the Glass music, I was looking at a different way to approach a documentary. And I was like hooked. I mean, after he showed me the trailer, I called up my assistant that night and I said, this is a great project we should work on. I really am going to work hard to get this. I said, but, I'm going to let you know that we're going to be working for about a year with a crazy man. And Bruce said to me, that's fine. Let's do it. Let's go. I'll go with you anywhere.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
So
that's great.
It took a while for Erroll to hire me, but eventually we got off the ground together.
My experience of that film is that it's true crime rendered as poetry.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's so much about the rhythm, like what you've done there with the red light, starting with the blinking red light in the distant tower and ending with the red light on the police car and all the red lights in between.
Yes.
And the repetitions of the variations of the reenactments, the firing of the fatal shot. I don't know how many times we hear that
a lot.
Shot fired, but it's a lot, and every time it's really like, I teach poetry, and I just said, this thing is a poem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's when I started working with Erroll, I did a rough cut of the opening of the film, and I had the two main characters, Randall Adams, who was the man falsely accused of the crime, who was in jail, and then the real killer, David Harris. And they were cut together in many instances in this little rough cut I did of the opening. And I did have bits and pieces of recreations in that and some graphics and stuff. And I showed it to Erroll, and Erroll was really happy with the way the opening, but what I did to put it together. But one thing he said to me is he set down a director rule for how not to edit. Every director has certain rules for how not to edit things they don't want to see. Mm-hmm. And so Erroll said to me, I really like what you did here with David and Randall meeting, he said, but they can't touch each other. Mm. And I said to Erroll, what do you mean they can't touch each other? He said, I don't want them cut side by side. Mm. I don't want to cut from Randall's face to David's face next to each other. He said, because what David did to Randall is so awful that David should not touch Randall. Mm. And I was like, okay, this is one of the wackiest editing rules I've ever been given by a director, but fine. So you want to cut away to separate David and Randall. He said, yes, yes, please.
Mm-hmm.
So the next morning, I thought, well, okay, I want to revise this for Erroll. I'm going to go and look at some of the outtakes of the bad recreations and see what's in there that I could maybe put in between the first time they're cut together. And the thing that hit me right off the bat, Dean, was this giant close-up of the police red light flashing. And, you know, I had remember the warning lights on the buildings in Dallas, and I thought, well, why don't we put this giant close-up in between the two of them, you know, and open it up a little bit and just kind of, Erroll also wanted the editing to be very jagged and anxiety-ridden. He didn't want it to be smooth. And so if you cut from a person to a flashing red light and then back to a person, and it's static, moving static, it's like, it's so jarring,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And so I threw that in, and I called Erroll in, and I said, Erroll, is this what you're thinking about? So is this a good way not for Randall and David to touch? And he flipped. He just said, yes, yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes. And so then, you know, the red light became a motif through the entire film. And as much as we could use red as a kind of color in various sequences, we did. So again, that was a nice way to kind of discover and unlock a key to putting the film together. And then it was kind of a great fun. It was like a challenge for me creatively. Every time I had David and Randall cut together, what do I put in between? What do I go to? What can I come up with creatively that will seem like an interesting thing for the audience to see? So it became a creative challenge for me as well. So sometimes these director editing rules that get laid down are fine because it actually spurs my creativity as far as I'm concerned. If you don't want to cut it that way, okay, I'm going to have to think about how to do it that makes you happy.
It's such a fascinating example of, I mean, something you see in all the arts, which is how a limitation
Yes.
can spur you to do something fabulous that you would not have thought of otherwise. I mean, to me, and I did not realize until you said it just now that we never see them cut side by side.
Yeah.
But of course the effect is there subliminally,
Yeah.
and what the subliminal effect is to make their realities far apart, is to keep them on different planets.
Exactly. That's what Erroll wanted.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then you bring in these other characters. Mrs. Miller, that she is so terrifying.
Uh-huh. I know. The so-called mystery witnesses.
The mystery witnesses.
Yeah.
I spent some time on a writing project with cops, and they refer to people like Mrs. Miller as police buffs. You know, she thinks she's seeing crimes being committed everywhere, and she can't wait to get involved, and she's going to, you know, bring the perpetrators to justice.
Right. Yeah, I think she was convinced that she saw what happened, and
yeah,
absolutely not the case.
Absolutely not. Yeah, and the, you know, the way the interviews are shot, they look so kind of crappy, like a bad porn film made in someone's basement. And there's something so raw and unforgiving about that.
Yeah, right. I know, it's true. Yeah. I mean, it was, you know, Erroll was not, he didn't want to dress anything up really. He wasn't concerned about visual appearances, whether it was the backgrounds or his people's makeup or any of those things. I mean, people were just shot where they lived basically and wore what they wore when they showed up, and he never tried to change any of them. There could have been ways, for example, you know, Randall's lawyer, who's a rather heavy woman, was not shot in a very flattering way.
Right.
So we didn't attempt to make her look sympathetic in any way by helping her with her hair or makeup or the setting that she was in. It was just, this was who she was and how he was going to present her. And that's it.
But she's
in terms of the documentary world, that's something that Erroll likes to adhere to. I mean, he doesn't want to dress anything up.
And what's great in that case is she's the most sympathetic person in the film.
Yes, right.
And the way that plays against the visual expectation is just, it's jarring and it's disquieting, and it's great.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the one shot, you know, the whole time we're seeing David Harris throughout the film.
Yes.
We don't know where he is.
Right.
He's wearing this red thing that we're going, wait, is that a jail uniform or just
It's an orange jumpsuit. Yeah, an orange jumpsuit.
Yeah, an orange like jumpsuit that's been in his closet since 1975 or something. And
Right.
and this screen that's behind him is kind of ambiguous. And then near the end, I forget what he's talking about, but he goes to scratch his head and he raises his hands into the frame for the first time, and we see he's in handcuffs.
Yep, exactly.
And when I saw that, I said, okay, this shot is here near the end, not because of what he's saying. Paul put it there because he wanted to save the reveal of the handcuffs till near the end. Is that right?
Close to right.
Uh-huh.
It's actually a part of a sequence that Erroll and I fought a lot about, which was the drive-in movie times, which we never had the material to really make it clear about the drive-in movie times, which was a key piece of evidence. But the way they talked about it, it was still confusing.
Mm-hmm.
But it was during that sequence when David was talking about going to the movies that he did the thing with the handcuffs. And in fact, at one point, we actually shot Erroll to explain some things about the case, to sprinkle through the film to make things a little more clear. And he did do a whole explanation of the drive-in movie times that was very clear. And we actually wound up cutting Erroll in at various points. But Erroll was actually a terrible interview. He was so nervous and uptight. And Erroll in real life, he always wears a suit and tie, but they're always kind of disheveled, and his hair looks like Einstein. And before the interview was shot, his wife combed his hair, bought him a new suit jacket, bought him a new tie, and he looked so spiffy compared to all the other interviews. It just didn't seem like him. And I mean, we tried, but it was terrible. And we had a screening with the sound editors, and afterwards, Erroll, it was a long distance screening. We were in New York, sound editors from San Francisco, and we sent them a copy of the film, and they looked at it, and they called us up, and they were raving about the film, but all of them said, the only thing we recommend that you do to make it better is take Erroll out.
Mm-hmm.
And we were already really questioning using him in the film anyway. We were this close to taking him out before we sent the film to San Francisco, but we kept it in. And so that told us to yank him out completely. But again, because the drive-in movie times was not really clear, but that moment was so important with the handcuffs that we just said, forget it. It's like, we'll just leave it, and we'll just trust that the audience will, either they'll get it or they won't. If they don't get it, it's worth it for that moment with the handcuffs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the case, because we've had screenings where people in the audience actually gasp when the handcuffs come up. Because like you, they're just not sure where David is.
And then also saving for around that time in the film, the reveal of the childhood trauma, the drowning of David's brother when he was 3 years old, and which, the first most obvious choice would be, put that at the beginning so we know who this is. But it's so much more powerful as we're coming to the final revelation of truth, the climax of the film, that we're starting to get, really what happened to this guy, how he was.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's actually, to be honest with you, it's my favorite scene in the film. And right from the beginning, when I watched all the dailies, before I started really diving in on the film, I really grew to hate David because of he was obviously a sociopath, but also a very troubled kid. But then when I saw the dailies where he did tell the story about the drowning of his brother, a whole different set of sympathies came up in me for David. And I realized how powerful that was. But I did think that in terms of the drama of the film, that it was necessary to make David's character for the audience get more and more evil, let the audience really feel his progression as a sociopath as you went through the film. But then before the final tape recording confession, do a twist on it. and suddenly show another side of David, that did apply some kind of sympathy that made how the audience was feeling about David, a little more complicated, a little more ambiguous,
Give us some emotional.
You just feel for him.
Yeah.
In his relationship with his father, the loss of his brother, being blamed for it. It's just, oh God, it always rips my heart open when I see the film.
Yeah, it's just we get this emotional whiplash. Wait, he's
Right.
okay. No, he's just a confused kid. No, he's evil. No, yeah. One of the many horrifying aspects of the film is when you say the police believed David, it becomes clear that the police wanted to believe David because if they could convict an adult, they could execute him.
That's very true. Yeah, no, they were definitely going for, the Texas style. They like the death penalty down there. So it's like, they wanted an adult conviction. He was also, an outsider. He wasn't a Texan. He was basically from, I think Randall lived in Missouri, and he was moving to another part of the country to try to get to change his life and get a better job. So he just got railroaded, And the police were so hell-bent on finding a cop killer, that when they had this young kid who was seemingly innocent and sweet, and they chose to believe him and use his testimony to get their conviction.
Now, this film grew out of a completely different idea, which was Erroll Morris was planning to make a film about a psychiatrist, Dr. Grigson, I believe, known as Dr. Death, because his specialty was giving expert testimony for prosecutors so that they could execute people, but they needed a psychiatrist to say this person is not only guilty, but he is going to commit other crimes if you don't execute him.
Exactly.
And he testified in this case, but somehow Dr. Death winds up not even appearing in the film. How did that happen?
Well, because, Erroll got sidetracked. I mean, he was investigating all of the cases that Dr. Death had testified in. And that's where he uncovered the Randall Adams case. And the more he read through the Randall Adams case, the more appalled he was at this, unbelievable injustice that had happened to him. Mm-hmm. And so he lost interest basically in Dr. Death and switched it over to doing this one story about Randall Adams and David Harris.
Well, one other thing I want to ask about the Thin Blue Line before we move on is the end.
Right.
Where we finally get the confession. We finally get the place that the whole film has been moving to, and we finally get the confession that frees this unjustly convicted man from prison.
Right.
And Errol's camera stops working.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it was... Again, it was this comedy of errors where David Harris was in Dallas at a lower security facility because he had to go to some hearings for another murder he committed. And so when he was in the federal penitentiary, they would not allow cameras in there. So Erroll was able to get permission in this, lower security facility that David was in, but David was only there for 2 days. And so he had to get in, get what he needed quickly, and then David was going to be taken back. And in the course of that, the camera got dropped, broke. Actually, the camera didn't get dropped, it broke, it stopped functioning. And they had to stop the shooting before Erroll really got to all the important questions. Which were always placed at the end of the interview. And so he just freaked out, and he was getting on the phone and trying to find another camera. Why they couldn't find another camera, I'm not sure. I mean, you're in Dallas, for God's sakes, you should be able to get another camera, but they couldn't for some reason. And so Erroll thought, okay, I only have one more day. He got permission to go back the next day, but he had the professional 1/4-inch tape recorder called a Nagra. He had that with him to record the rest of the questions, at least have it on audio. And he dropped that because he was so nervous.
Oh my God.
And then all he had left was that tiny little Sony pocket recorder, which he always used for pre-interviews. When he was, doing research for his films, he would always tape people on this tiny Sony. So he had that with him in his pocket. And so all he could do then was, hold that against the phone. Because he didn't have a camera, they said you have to do the phone thing. So he held the thing against the phone and then was able to ask David all the important questions. And when I started cutting the film, he was constantly on the phone with the prison authorities in Texas, trying to get permission to go back and shoot the important parts of the interview with David. And they kept saying no. They kept saying no, 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 no. They didn't want this case to get uncovered. They didn't want the injustice to be uncovered. So any obstacle they could put in Erroll's way, they would. And so they just refused. And finally I said to him, I said, well, Erroll, let me listen to the audio. Let me listen to what you got on the Sony. Maybe that's, one of my rules as an editor is use what you have. It's like make the best of what you're given, of what you have on hand, be it good or bad. You may think it's bad. Erroll kept saying the audio is bad. You can hardly hear it. It's terrible. It's terrible. It's awful. I said, let me hear it, will you? And so I sat down with the tape recording and listened to it. And it was like, an hour and a half of the most chilling interview I think I've ever heard in my life, because David was constantly playing mind games with Erroll and manipulating him and, saying things in such a way that you had to read everything between the lines. And, his whole sociopathology was right there on that tape. It was just an unbelievable thing. But it also raised the hair on the back of my neck. And I just said, Erroll, you got it.
Yes.
The confession is here. It really is. I mean, basically between the lines, he says that he's the killer. I said, let's use this, And he said, well, what are we going to look at? What are we going to look at? And I said, well, through this whole film, you've been illustrating things with bizarre objects like giant popcorn kernels and milkshakes. And I said, shoot the tape recorder. This is the documentary object that captured this confession. Let's just watch it spin around.
Yes.
And he was like, oh God, yeah, okay, let's do this. He actually storyboarded the tape recorder. I took the hour and a half confession, cut it down to the essence, the 2-minute scene or whatever it is, cut it down to the essence. And then he sat down with his production designer, Teddy Bafalukas, and they storyboarded how they wanted to shoot the tape recorder to go along with David's lines. I mean, the two of them had a blast storyboarding this thing, and they shot it that way. They shot it that way, And there's something that's so chilling about it because you hear these disembodied voices. It's the first time you hear Erroll's voice in the film, which is very strange because he's got an odd voice. But there's something about the disembodiment that you don't, we've just seen David tell the story about his brother's drowning. Our sympathies for him are up. And then you hear this voice, this again, manipulating Erroll, and Erroll trying to manipulate him, but there's something that's very chilling about not seeing them, the disembodiment of the voice, just looking at this bizarre object that captured this conversation. It's so effective. It's really surprising. I mean, there's a kind of, it's almost like a Brechtian distance device in a certain way, where you're kind of pulling the audience away instead of pulling the audience in. And I think that is part of why it worked so effectively because of that.
Once again, it's the limitations and the accidents that force something great to happen. Erroll must have been tearing his hair out, but
yeah.
What we wind up with is through the whole film, we've been seeing people and seeing them lie. And when we finally get to the truth, this object, this tape recorder, it's like we found the holy grail of truth.
Yes.
And
Sony tape recorder.
In the little Sony tape recorder, this little funky, precious object, and the fact that the audio is crappy, we have to strain a little to hear it. It's great because it's like truth is hard to get to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's why we subtitled it as well. I mean, just to make sure that people really could get it.
Yeah.
Erroll really worried about the quality of the sound, so we decided to subtitle as well. But again, the subtitles is another distancing device. It fit into the aesthetic of how that worked.
Right.
Now, I think that has been done many times since, and sometimes you'll see a phone conversation on a documentary, and they'll maybe show the voice signal.
Yeah.
to your understanding, was this the first time that was done? That innovation of yours? That
God, I
without
don't know.
boasting, just
I really don't know. I'm not that much of a film historian to know whether somebody else had done that before Erroll or not, you know. But in our case, it worked beautifully, and it really was the only thing we could do, because right to the very end, I mean, Erroll didn't give up, even though we cut the scene and designed the scene and did it. Erroll still kept calling the Texas authorities. He was like hell bent on getting David on camera, but it didn't matter. I mean, finally, he finally gave up.
Yep. And actually, one of the later examples of that device being used was in your work in the Ken's Vietnam War film, where we've got the taped conversations between Nixon and Kissinger, and I think LBJ and McNamara before that.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it was definitely, we basically used the same kind of device.
So let's talk about how you got from the Thin Blue Line and Errol Morris to Ken Burns, and then once you got to Ken, you stayed there.
Right. Well, just before I did the Thin Blue Line, I had cut the Statue of Liberty with Ken. And it was my best experience up to that point of working with a director, because I actually at that point felt like I had the experience of working with a real director. I mean, somebody who knew film so well that they knew exactly what they wanted to do. And it was kind of a joy to work with somebody like that, because Ken knew all the aspects of film, from cinematography to editing to music to, he was such a film nut and film lover and great creative craftsman in all kinds of areas. So it was a joy to do that. And the film itself was, to this day, The Statue of Liberty is still my favorite film I've ever cut. And it was a great, wonderful experience. And when we were finishing that film, he said to me, "I'm planning this history of the Civil War, and I'd love you to come back and work with me on it." And I said, "Ken, anything you do, I will come back. Just call, I'll be there." And then I went off and did the Thimble Line. And what happened with Erroll was that, being the crazy man that he is, I couldn't get him to lock the film. I couldn't get him to say it's done. And I was scheduled, I think, to start with Ken in November, and I went a week over, 2 weeks over, 3 weeks over, 4 weeks over, 5 weeks over, and Ken kept calling because he was, he had a schedule, he wanted to get started, and Erroll would not give birth to his baby and kept making changes constantly. I mean, it was crazy. I mean, it was driving me nuts, because I really wanted to go back and work with Ken, because I knew it was going to be much more satisfying. I wasn't going to be, forcing a director to work. Ken's a workaholic. It's easy to get him to sit down in the cutting room and work together. Erroll is a totally different story. I was dying to get away from Erroll, to be honest with you. It was like, enough already. And so finally, I finally got him to lock. It was a 3-day, 72-hour locking session. We didn't go home for 3 days until Erroll finally said, "Okay, it's done." Yeah. And then I went on to start the Civil War, the following week, and settled into something that was a little more sane. Not that I regret doing the Thimble Line by any means. I think it's a great film. I'm very proud of it, and it was, in many ways, a wonderful experience to do it with Erroll, and I'm glad I was able to, pull that film out of him, because it was so locked up inside him. It was just really difficult. And I think that the combination of the two of us, I mean, I'm very much a narrative guy. It's like, I want to tell a story. I wanted to have a beginning, middle, and end. And Erroll kept saying to me, "I hate plot. I hate narrative. I don't want this to make sense. You're making it make too much sense. Stop it." It's like, pull that piece of the interview out because it's too clear. I mean, those are the kinds of things we were doing in the cutting room. But I think that the combination of his wanting things to be a little more obscure, a little more unclear, a little more mysterious, with the tension of me wanting to make it more of a through line and make sense. It actually helped the film. I mean, because I think you do arrive at the end of the film, you're not confused. You're convinced David is the killer and that Randall was railroaded. So we were able to achieve both of the ends we were trying to achieve. So it was a good tension. It was tough and it was hard. And sometimes that happens with directors who are so locked up into their material and their projects. Sometimes it's the fighting that you have to do with them that produces the best work.
Right.
And that was the case with Erroll, and with Ken, it's the opposite. It's much more calm and thoughtful and worked through and much more simpatico with him. So then I did the Civil War with him, and from there on, it's pretty much was Ken from there on in.
Would you tell the story, please, about when you were working on the Civil War, and you were sitting in, I believe, in the editing room with Ken. I'm not sure if there were other people there, and it was just before bringing in the assassination of Lincoln.
Oh God, yeah. Well, that was actually in the mixing studio when we were mixing the film, and it's obviously the last episode, we had mixed all the film up to the assassination scene, and by that point of working on the film, Ken had been working on it for 5-6 years. I was only on it for 2, but both of us had so fallen in love with Abraham Lincoln and deeply fell in love with him to the point where we wanted to change history if we could. And so it was in the mixing studio, and we were getting to the point where the narrative was telling about Booth getting ready to shoot him. And just before the sound effect of the shot was about to be laid in, Ken just stopped. Lee Dichter was our sound mixer, a great sound mixer, and Lee just like jumped and Ken sort of sat down again and said, "Lee, I don't know if I can do this." And Ken and I looked at each other. I mean, we were both teared up. It was just like, we knew the film was coming to a close. We were very proud of what we had achieved. But it was just like, we just didn't want him to get shot. And we had to sit there for a few minutes and just calm down and, then become practical. It's like, okay, how much an hour are we paying for this? I think we better let Lee get back to work. Put the shot in, come on, let's go. Bite the bullet, let's, he died, we have to kill him, and let's do it. So, yeah, but it was a very, very emotional moment because we were just so close to the material at that time. Yeah. It happens.
Yeah.
Living with the Roosevelts for 5 years was a joy in my life. Believe me.
No, it's such a beautiful story, and I mean, really, to me, that just brings out its heart.
Right.
And that if great filmmaking, like great anything, it's got to have heart.
Yeah. I think the more the filmmakers feel it themselves, the more it's going to come through in the film, I think.
Right. So that brings us to Statue of Liberty, which I know has a whole lot of your heart in it.
Yeah, right. Well, that's my girl. There's 2 monuments in the U.S. that I absolutely adore, and one is the Statue of Liberty, and the other is the Vietnam Wall in Washington. And they both mean opposite things. It's like the best side of America, the worst side of America. When I moved to Manhattan and went to NYU to school, one of the things I wanted to do almost immediately when I got to New York was to go visit the Statue of Liberty. And it was a kind of an epiphany for me to actually see it for real. And the whole trip from Battery Park, taking the ferry, and as you're crossing the water, she just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's not until you're right under her that you realize how massive she is and how gloriously beautiful she is. And then embodying this amazing idea of liberty, and realizing that it was the gift of the French to America for the achievement of creating this amazing American democracy. It hits you like gangbusters, And then you go through the museum and read this whole story about the building of the statue and the campaign by the American public to raise the money to build the base, and all these kids sending in pennies and nickels to, finish off the base of the statue when the funds had run out, and Hearst's amazing newspaper campaign to achieve that, and it's just a monumental, unbelievable thing, and to realize that when immigrants came in from Europe and all over the world in the 19th century, especially, and into the 20th century, the first thing they see coming into New York Harbor is a statue, and she basically is a welcoming figure. I mean, when I first saw her, the immigration issue was not such a huge thing, so divisive as it is now in the country. But, she has so much meaning to the immigrants who come in. And they, the other thing that Ken did in making the film was to interview a lot of immigrants and have them talk about their experience of seeing her for the first time. And in the second part of the film is that wonderful sequence where there's little snippets of people who talk about seeing her for the first time. And they come from all over the world. And it's to me, it's one of my favorite scenes in the whole film, because it's such an amazing array of people. It's like an usher at Fenway Park who came from Italy, and a grandma with two little kids who came from Ukraine, and a Haitian immigrant, and they all have something different and interesting to say.
And the grandma with two little kids, one of whom
is Colonel
Vindman, who we saw recently in the congressional hearings
in the,
Trump in Ukraine. Exactly. Coincidentally, isn't that something?
It is something. I mean, I didn't remember that. I didn't realize that. I was watching Stephen Colbert, and he had that when Colonel Vindman was testifying. He showed the clip, and I was like, "Oh my God!" I was blown away, totally blown away. Yeah, but it's just and the other thing that is so amazing to me in that film, and that really hit me when I was cutting it with Ken, was James Baldwin's interview. Because again, as an African American living in this country, and Ken asked him, what does liberty mean to you? And he goes into this incredibly eloquent piece about, how can it possibly mean much of anything to, a Black man living in this country, because racism is so, oppressive still, and he was so hard about it. It was like he wasn't going to give an inch. He wasn't going to get sentimental about this monument by any means, because it didn't have any real meaning for him. Certainly not the way it was, when Ken interviewed him in the early '80s, and it wouldn't be the same for any African American now. And you think back to Frederick Douglass's speech about what does the 4th of July mean to me, which was essentially a kind of paraphrase of what Baldwin said in the film. But it's a really, really powerful moment in the film. And again, that's something that, one thing I take away from working with Ken that I'm very proud of is that he always went out of his way to examine the issues of race that came up in almost every single film that he made. Whether it was race in baseball with the Jackie Robinson story, obviously freeing the slaves in the Civil War, touching on racial issues like, trying to pass legislation, anti-lynching legislation in the Roosevelt film. He's always looking for a way to think about, where is America standing in terms of race at the various junctures of these films that he's making. And I always deeply appreciated the fact that he went out of his way to do that. Another filmmaker could say, well, at the time, especially the late '70s, it's like, why put Baldwin in there? He's kind of ruining the good vibe about what the statue's all about. It's like, but, a reminder of the people she's not really representing that's what Ken's films are all about in many ways. It's the good side and the bad side of America, constantly juxtaposed. And I really appreciate that as what he's trying to do as a historical filmmaker.
Can you talk about your process with Ken, your working relationship? Whereas in, say, The Thin Blue Line, where you gave the film so much of its shape and feel and rhythm, I know that in Ken's case, his films are much more scripted. They're much more written. He's got great writers like Jeff Ward working with him. So how does your freedom to tell the story as an editor work in that kind of situation?
Well, I think it's absolutely great that we have a script as a starting point. And Ken won't let the editors start cutting until he's gone through 3 or 4 drafts that he feels are in good shape to start cutting. He wants to make sure that the storyline and the characters are starting to really feel good on paper. But what's on paper doesn't always work on film. But it's always a great place to start. It's like a blueprint. Like any script on a feature film, many directors just call them blueprints. And it's not till you actually shoot them and the actors bring what they bring to it. It's not till you start to build the story visually that you can see if the script is really working or not. And so the process of editing the films with Ken is a constant process of rewriting. And he'll constantly, change the position of interviews and move them from the beginning to the end or the end of the beginning. He'll take an interview and cut it in half. He'll take a quote and pull out 3 sentences to make it more compressed. He'll actually ask the writers to rewrite some narration, reduce it from 6 sentences down to 3. We can get this to be much more essential. And then whenever he's like a surrogate audience when he watches the rough cuts, and he says, that's not clear to me, and he'll turn to the writer and say, what do you mean when you wrote this? Or what was the fact here? What actually happened? How can we clarify this? Because it's not clear to me. So this constant rewriting that goes on over especially with a series, which usually is a 2-year cutting period, the script is constantly changed through that 2-year period, based on responses that Ken has to the storytelling. Everything gets compressed, everything gets much more rich, it becomes more clear, it becomes more emotional. It's quite a remarkable process. And he works so fast that when you're, one of the worst jobs for Ken is typing the changes on the computer and on the, because his ideas are coming so quickly that it's hard to keep up with him. And I have seen him reduce many of those people to tears because they can't keep up with him. And he gets frustrated because it's like his mind is churning with these changes, and this person can't quite keep up with the thought processes. Sometimes I or the producer would have to go, Ken, slow down, slow down. Wait a minute, let them catch up, will you please? Hold it a minute, hold that thought.
Right. I think the ironic thing about the jobs that all these people are doing, and in particular, I think the job of the editor, is that the better you do the job, the more the audience doesn't realize there was anyone doing a job.
Yeah.
It just winds up feeling like, well, of course that's the story. Of course that shape of the story is inevitable. It must have just fallen from the tree like that. Yeah,
right, exactly. I know. Yeah, we're supposed to be, our craft, our art is meant to be invisible. It's not like cinematography. You're not supposed to notice the beauty of the image. It's not even like music or sound where you appreciate the beauty of the audio gifts that are being given. It's we're supposed to be invisible. When the cuts come, you don't want the audience to know there was a cut there. You want the audience to be flowing along with the storyline, which is being told very clearly. And with Ken, it was the opposite of Erroll, where Erroll wanted all the cutting to be self-conscious. He wanted the editing to be anxious. He wanted the audience to notice cuts. He wanted jump cuts and slam cuts, and he wanted cuts to bang people in the face. And with Ken, it's the opposite. He wants everything smoothed out. All the cuts have to be invisible. They have to be perfectly flowing so that the audience doesn't notice any edits whatsoever.
You have a funny cut in the Thin Blue Line, which is when
many funny cuts in there.
Yeah, no, but this one was this was a comedy cut, which is when someone is talking about the lady in red who was really the lady in orange, and she went back to Romania, and then you cut to the map of of Romania and it's in the native language, and we see Bucharesti, and no one says anything about it. We just, okay, here's the map, that's it, she's gone. And
right.
It's hilarious.
Right. Yeah, no, it was, again, it was one of those oddball things that Erroll just loved, It's totally unexpected, and it's not documentary-like. It's not seamless. It doesn't make any sense. And so that was something that didn't make a lot of sense that he adored.
Yeah, me too.
You know, I mean, for Erroll, the world at large never makes sense to him. So, you know, in the world of film, why should anything in film make sense? You know, it's like, let's just throw some curveballs in here and mess things up, you know. Right. Whose life is smooth? Come on, get over
it. to Dean's point about editing being invisible, good editing, and your comment about that. Do you watch many movies, and can you even watch a movie without noticing the editing and give yourself over the experience?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, the first time I watch a movie, I just surrender myself totally to the story and the characters. And I'm hoping that the filmmaking is good enough that I am totally surrendered and I don't notice anything and I don't question anything. But, you know, I love films so much that I just want to be lost in them and captured by them and what they're trying to tell me. And, you know, if a film is bad or it's badly cut or badly directed, you know, then I start to notice things. It's like, oh, that shot's not so good. Oh, that could have been edited faster. And, you know, then I start to get annoyed because it's like, this isn't really very good. Let's shut it off now. That's enough. Yeah. But, you know, if a film is really well done, it's just, I just want to be lost in it. So I actually have to go back. If I want to look at something more closely about how was it edited or how was it shot, or I actually have to do a second or third viewing to really concentrate on that because I get so caught up in the story.
As a kid, were you a film buff?
Oh, huge film buff. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was something that, you know, from a very early age, you know, watching Saturday morning cartoons, which back in the 50s and was a treasure trove of amazing American and European cartoons, all kinds of wacky things. I mean, it was just unbelievable. It was just, you didn't know what to expect. You know, from Mickey Mouse cartoons to Gertie the Dinosaur to Betty Boop to, you know, German silhouette fairy tale cartoons. It was, you know, that was a part of my learning experience as a film audience, was this kind of cornucopia that was on Saturday mornings. You know, so when it came time to, you know, start to watch European art films and stuff, it was like, oh yeah, okay, let me see this crazy German film. You know, it's not going to be like, you know, John Ford for sure, but I want to see it.
Right. Now, zooming forward again, when we get to the Roosevelts, you were a producer as well as editor. Yeah. How is that different?
Well, again, it's, you know, I'm basically was the principal producer and overseeing the entire production, pre-production, production, and post-production. You know, in that case, I'm, you know, hiring the crew, setting the schedules, working with all of the historic sites to schedule filming, working with our archival researchers about what photographs and stock footage to gather in, working with the historians and archivists at the individual historic sites to see what they had on hand that we could use that would be useful for the film, working very closely with the scriptwriters about shaping the scripts, you know, what stories from their careers needed to be told. I was consulting with Jeff Ward, and Jeff would consult with me about certain issues that would come up script-wise. You know, talking with Ken about who should be potential interviews and booking the interviews and where they're going to be shot and what they're going to look like. I mean, it's, oh my God. You know, there's so many problems in producing as opposed to, you know, like I said, editing is where you're solving problems. And you can reach final solutions. When you're in production as a producer, the problems are infinite and often you don't solve them all. And you just have to live with, you know, what you can get around, you know. It's total craziness. It's totally opposite from the job of editing. And whereas editing is much more solitary and you're confined in a room and you're locked into the screen and you're in the life inside the screen, when you're producing, you've got the entire real world, you know, filled with all of these crazy characters, you know, from park rangers to archivists to historians to security people and you know, crazy crew people with strange habits. And, you know, you have to deal with all of that real world stuff and try to make everybody cohere to get this film in the can. It gets to be a little crazy when you're producing.
Did you enjoy that craziness?
I did to a certain extent. I mean, it would often get incredibly stressful. You know, it's like You've got a cinematographer who's trying to light 3 rooms in the Theodore Roosevelt birthplace and has 40 lights set up with all kinds of electrical wires hanging over the historical railings of the Theodore Roosevelt birthplace and scattered around into the basement, into the offices, even outside into outside outlets to be able to get enough electricity to light these 3 rooms. And you've got, you know, the supervising ranger at the birthplace screaming at you that, you know, you can't blow out our electricity. You can't put these wires here. Why do you have so many lights? Does this have to happen? Can't you do this with 5 less? Mm-hmm. Those kinds of situations was kind of crazy, you know. And of course you have to be nice and diplomatic. You know, you can't really lose your cool because you don't want to get kicked out of the Theodore Roosevelt birthplace. We need to get these shots done. So you have to be on your best behavior. You know, you have to occasionally go into the bathroom and scream and then come out with a smile on your face and try to placate everybody.
Episode 4 of the Roosevelts.
Yeah.
Which is Franklin Roosevelt coming down with polio.
Yeah.
Is I think really the kind of the emotional center of the whole series. Can you talk about that episode?
Yeah, I you know, when I was delving into their lives, first of all, I should say, I mean, I'm the child of parents who adored the Roosevelts. So I was born in 51, and my mother and father had lived through the Depression, had lived through the World War II. And so to them, Franklin and Eleanor were their great heroes. You know, it was like, I heard about them constantly. You know, when an anniversary would come around, like Pearl Harbor, or, you know, when the European War ended, or the bomb dropping, you know, they would just start telling stories about, you know, their experiences during that time. My father wasn't in the war. He was, because he had 5 kids, wasn't forced to go in. But anyway, it's like I grew to love them, you know, just because of my parents. But then researching for the film, I learned more and more and more about them. And again, when I was a kid, it was mentioned that Franklin had polio, but I didn't really know what that meant. And I never thought that his disability was as widespread as it actually was. I mean, basically he could not move from here down, you know. Anything from his chest down was basically immobile. He was gone. And I didn't realize that until we were researching the film. And, you know, and then realizing how ambitious he was, you know, basically he wanted to become his cousin Theodore. So he had this ambition to be president, you know, from a very young age. So his political ambitions were quite strong. He became the vice presidential candidate in 1920. James Cox was the presidential candidate, but they lost that election. That's when Harding was elected. And so it kind of dashed his hopes. And then 2 years later, in 22, is when he came down with polio. And he just thought, you know, that's the end of me. I'm done for, you know. And so the story of him recovering himself from that unbelievable tragedy was, I mean, it just hit me like gangbusters, you know, and especially realizing how bad the disability was. And then, you follow him through that, the first 2-3 years of that depression, and then see him create Warm Springs in Georgia, this rehabilitation center for polio victims. And that's where you see Franklin become the Franklin that we know as president. Because prior to that, he was a rather privileged, rich kid. He was a bit snotty, a bit elitist, didn't mingle that much really with, you know, working folk and regular folk. And, you know, he was an aristocrat. And the experience of bringing all those kids and all of those people from disparate backgrounds to the Warm Springs Rehabilitation Center, and trying to help all of those, that wide range of human beings who were afflicted with this horrible disease, it expanded his empathy exponentially. I mean, he could relate to those folks, you know, from 4 years old to 34 years old, whoever they were, black, white, male, female, you know, with different immigration extraction. it's like his heart just opened to that whole citizenry of polio victims that came to Warm Springs. And I think that was the basis of that gave him the strength and gave him the empathy to be able to pull America through the Great Depression and through World War II. I mean, it's just, you know, and thinking about this man who was so horribly disabled, doing that, the strength that was involved. I mean, because, you know, getting him around from place to place was an ordeal. You know, he had to be carried everywhere. He had to be in the wheelchair to be transported. And on top of that, he also said to all of his people, I don't want people to know that I can't walk. And he couldn't walk. He had developed this, you know, as you see in the film, that odd swinging of his legs with the crutches. So he was kind of like he would call it a movable tower. You know, he would just swing his legs in front of him, and was able to manipulate, you know, do that for maybe 5, 6, 8 steps. And then it would be so exhausting that he'd have to stop. So he couldn't go very far. But the Secret Service would, you know, they would put up, you know, tents so he could get around without people knowing he was in a chair. You know, they would arrange his schedule so he could arrive someplace early and be put into a position where he was sitting or standing at a lectern to address people. And then the people would come in. So you would never have to see him come in and out of a room. All that stuff would be arranged because he didn't want the public to know how bad his disability was. You know, I mean, maybe it was foolish of him, but again, at the time, when you were that disabled, there was a real stigma about it. You know, you just weren't normal. And he didn't want the American public to think that, you know, a man who was not normal was their president. An astonishing achievement on his part, you know. And for me, I mean, I cut episode 4. And so the polio sequence, when he contracts polio and starts his recovery, was very difficult because there were no visuals. He and his mother insisted that no photographs be taken of him during that time. So all cameras were banned, you know, and this was a man who loved the camera, you know, just like his cousin Theodore, you know, if a cameraman was around, he was willing to perform. But, you know, during that period of time, it was nothing. And so we had to create those sequences out of images that were more evocative of the place and of the emotion he was going through than to actually be able to see him. Or we had to take photographs that were shot of him just prior to contracting polio, or maybe a little bit later when he was more comfortable with the camera coming back around 1925, 1926, and take some of those portraits of him and kind of, you know, fake them in as if it was 1922. And it was all very, very tricky to be able to make that work. But I do think that those sequences are quite powerful because the writing and the voiceovers and the imagery, you know, work in conjunction with each other so beautifully. And the score for that sequence is Aaron Copeland's Third Symphony, which is it's one of my favorite pieces of music. And when I was, excuse me, sorry, I'm getting, getting a little emotional here. But when I was thinking about what music might work, I went back and listened to that, and it's the slow movement is what I used for the polio sequence, and it actually runs through the entire thing. I had to cut it and take out some of the more bombastic parts of it. You know, I used all of the slower sections, and so whenever a horn or a string got too crazy, I had to cut the music so that it remained within the mood of the piece, which was again a challenge. And I know that Copeland was probably rolling in his grave the way I was cutting his composition, but sorry, Aaron, it worked for the polio scene.
It worked.
Forgive me.
You know, the subtitle of the Roosevelt series is An Intimate History.
Yes.
And I think that was so right on target. That and it was so important to tell people that, okay, this is not just about, you know, great men doing great deeds, but it's what's inside them that makes that possible.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it definitely is true. You know, and I think that Jeff and Ken achieved an amazing balance between the personal and the political in putting the whole film together with all three characters. I mean, it really is a wonderful weaving of the two things. And also, I was really happy because we weren't going to skirt any of the issues of sexuality or possible affairs that were going on, you know, in Eleanor's life or in Franklin's life. You know, and one of the great things in the film is Margaret Suckley, who was Franklin's companion in his later years, and was so close to him. Nobody really knows if that relationship was sexual or not, but they certainly loved each other and leaned on each other, you know, constantly. Especially because, I mean, Eleanor essentially was, you know, a political part of Franklin's life in those later years, especially when he was president. But Margaret was the one who supplied the personal side. And when her diaries and letters were discovered in her home in upstate New York, the people who discovered them, the first people they called was Jeff Ward, because Jeff had written these two wonderful biographies of Franklin. And they thought if anybody, and the folks who ran that house, historic home up there, were so thrilled to find these that they called him immediately. And he created a book out of the letters and diaries called Closest Companion. And so when he got ready to write the script, and we had our first meeting about the script, you know, Jeff said, I really want to bring Margaret in to the story because nobody really knows this part of their life. And again, it was so personal. The excerpts from the letters are just so beautiful that you really get a sense of that he had, you know, not just someone for his head like Eleanor, but he had someone for his heart who was with him. That was Margaret. And so, I mean, again, putting those details into the film, I think, just made it all the richer because you saw the need that these, you know, really great figures had for that kind of emotional support.
And of course, the other element that for Jeff was so intensely personal, Jeff Ward, the writer, is that he also suffered from polio.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, that's actually where Jeff's interest in Franklin came from. And again, like me, when he was younger, he was so unaware of the extent of the disability. And for Jeff, it's one leg below the knee that's affected by the polio damage. So his disability isn't anywhere near as bad as Franklin's. But when you live with that disability, it does affect you physically all over your body in other ways, especially as you get older. You know, it gets harder to move around, even if if your disability is minor like Jeff's. As he gets older, it gets harder for him. His mobility is less and less because of that disability. And so that's where Jeff's interest came, was from, you know, and as he kept researching Franklin, he was more and more surprised at the full extent of the damage that he was living through.
The interview sequence with Jeff about the polio, which I understand Ken saved that for the very end of the interview.
Yeah, exactly. Jeff was very reluctant, you know, to do it because he's a very reserved man. He doesn't want to break down on camera and do that kind of thing. So he knew it was going to happen, but, you know, he was very wary about it. And yes, indeed, I mean, when we did the interview with Jeff, it was pretty extensive. I think he's a really wonderful presence through the entire film. But, you know, after about an hour, then Ken started to get into the area of the polio. And by that point, Jeff was really warmed up and, you know, was really enjoying talking about Franklin. And so I think by, you know, holding those questions till the end, it made it easier for him emotionally to talk about it, you know, with great clarity and emotion. He still did tear up, you know, he couldn't help himself. But it's a fantastic interview. I mean, he's just,
it's so effective because you feel that intensity from Jeff. And of course, for most people, they're not going to know where it's coming from.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, we debated whether to, you know, somehow let people know that Jeff himself was a polio victim, but finally decided against it. We just said, no, we'll just let it go. You know, some people will know, some people won't. Maybe it'll be in some of the publicity, you know, maybe not. So, but we just didn't want to make a big deal out of it. He didn't want it either.
Okay. So, the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Was this your last film with Ken?
Yeah, it was the last series that I worked on. And I wasn't involved in the producing of that at all. I just edited 2.5 of the episodes.
And I recently rewatched episode 9, which is I think that's titled. Is it titled "The War at Home"? Maybe not.
Can't remember, Dean.
Yeah, but it's where you get the rise of the anti-war movement, and in particular the veterans against the war.
Yeah, Vietnam veterans against the war, right?
Yeah, and it's so moving and so contemporary.
Yeah.
Because people are dealing with a government that's lying to them, and a government whose lies are causing people's deaths.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No, when we were, you know, early on in the process, you know, the editors kind of divvy up the episodes, and I specifically asked Ken, I said, can I do episode 9? Because I wanted to do John Kerry's speech to Congress and the Vietnam veterans against the war throwing their medals back on the steps of Congress. I mean, there were two scenes that, you know, 2 things I remember vividly. You know, I was in high school and early in college in those years, and so I had very vivid memories of all of that. But I specifically wanted to deal with those sequences because they were, you know, I felt very strongly about them. You know, especially because Kerry had gotten when he ran for president, you know, the whole swift boating thing that happened to him was so unfair. And again, you know, he was so accused of telling nothing but lies in his speech, which was so untrue. When you look at the entire speech, it was so powerful. And so I really felt as part of the editing team that I wanted to do right by Mr. Kerry and you know, give him a much more honest presentation of what he did there. And I think that the speech itself is very, very effective, the way it's done in the film, and the throwing the medals back is one of the most powerful scenes, I think, in any of Ken's work.
Yeah.
You know, it's such an amazing, amazing thing, you know, to see them do that.
Right. The use of music in that episode.
Yeah.
And in particular, "Gimme Shelter,"
yes,
which plays under that scene, throwing the medals over the fence. Right. And the way you go from I wanted to ask you about the way you go from the verse where we're hearing the sung lyrics, and then the music fades back, and we're just it's like vamping or something as we're getting the voiceover. The whole rhythm of that is so effective. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, well, it's the same thing where, you know, I couldn't follow the Rolling Stones structure of the music and just have it run, you know, over the scene. I had to do some manipulation with the music. You know, often the lyrics were fighting with the narration. And so I wanted to have instrumental parts where the narration was coming on, or where the interviews were. And so I had to kind of cut around the structure of the original song, but still give the sense of a beginning and an end to the song throughout. It's always a tricky thing to do with you know, musical compositions with lyrics when you're dealing with a heavily narrated film. But, you know, there is quite an extensive instrumental break in "Gimme Shelter," and the lyrics are rather simple, and that helped a great deal. So I didn't have to, you know, massacre the song so much. Mm-hmm. Let's hope. I'm sure some people notice it. Actually, one of my other editors, Craig Mellish, was a huge Stones fan, and he actually noticed something that was a bit rough in my musical cutting, and he actually helped me smooth it out. So Thanks to you, Craig. Again, that's when you have an editing staff, you're always consulting with each other or going to screenings, and, you can help each other solve some of these problems. And Craig helped me do that with that. The other scene in 9 that I love is the wall sequence, of course. Again, because it's, one of my top 2 monuments. So I felt very strongly about wanting to cut that. And Ken had gathered, so many amazing interviews with folks responding to the wall that there was a massive amount of material of responses to it. And so how to put that together and make it as effective as possible. And again, using Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water was a wonderful choice to use as music for that scene. And in fact, the scene starts with the Simon and Garfunkel version, and you hear some of the lyrics, and I use some of the instrumental there. But then when you get into the extensive interview part about what the wall meant to people, it was so, you couldn't use the lyrics anymore. It was just, they just fought each other. And so we had a wonderful composer named David Sierre who wrote other pieces of music for the film. And I called David and I said, David, do you think you could do an instrumental version of Bridge Over Troubled Water that would cover these interviews? And I had a rough cut of the scene. And so I showed him how I used Simon and Garfunkel on the first part. And then I showed him where the interviews came in, and I said, okay, from here on, David, can you take over and give me an instrumental version that has the same feel as the Simon and Garfunkel, that'll be in the same key, and will, we can seamlessly go from Simon and Garfunkel into the instrumental. And he did a beautiful job with that piece of music. I mean, it was just gorgeous what he did. And I think I had to cut it once only because we lifted 1 or 2 interviews out to make it a little shorter, but otherwise it's all David. So, but he was again, when you're working with a composer, it's such a joy when, they can work closely with you and get the same kind of effect that you're trying to achieve without throwing the emotional feel off at all. And he's kind of a wonder at doing that.
Yeah. The other great musical moment in that episode is when Hal Kushner, after all his years of captivity as a POW, is coming home, and the song is Ray Charles's version of America the Beautiful, which is the version you could have used there.
Absolutely, because it's Ray,
Yeah.
Absolutely, I mean, because, he had little changes in the lyrics that were very interesting that applied. And it's also the emotion of his delivery there was very ambiguous in this delivery. And I think that all added to the power of the scene of the POWs coming home. It was both celebratory in a way, but also questioning in a way, without getting too heavy-handed in that regard. We did have one Vietnam vet who reacted strongly that he hated it. And he said, you cannot play America the Beautiful on this scene. This is a desecration. This is, he watched the whole series. He said, I love everything else about the series. I hate this. If you don't change this, I'm never going to speak to you. I mean, he really got hot and heavy with Ken. I'm never going to speak to you again if you keep this.
But in kind of the bigger picture on that, and I've heard Ken talk about this, which is the healing nature of this film. There's so many people with so many open, emotional open wounds, even all these years later. And the fact that you bring in the Vietnamese in Vietnam, the Vietnamese here, the North, the South, the draft resistors, the veterans, everyone has wounds.
Yes. No, I think that's also what I loved about the film. It was, including the Vietnamese, both North and South, was a brilliant idea. I mean, absolutely brilliant. And there was real pushback at first when the film was being conceived and planned, even from Ken, because Ken is so America-centric. It's like, you know, all my films are about America. They're all about Americans. It's all about American democracy. It's like, well, I don't really want to bring in Vietnamese, and I don't want to do subtitles, and, you know, and the co-producer, co-director, Lynn Novick, fought him, you know, valiantly, and to her credit, she won. And I think it makes the film all the richer to include the Vietnamese in the film. And I don't think the way we handle the subtitles, I don't think it's hard to read. I don't think it's distracting. And there's just this richness of being able to intercut, you know, all the groups who were involved, you know, the pro-war people, the anti-war people, the North, the South Vietnamese. It just made it all the richer, this whole history of what this horrible war did, you know, on all sides. It was a masterstroke, I think, to include them. It just made the film all the better, as far as I'm concerned.
And tracking down the photographer who took the famous picture of the little girl running, who had been napalmed, running down the road with no clothes on. Like any documentary about the war would have to include, well, and on such and such a date, this photo appeared in newspapers all over the world and changed people's feeling about the war. But to track down the photographer and find out that he, in fact, didn't just take this picture and leave, but that he took the girl and her sibling, the other children, to the hospital, and then to see that she survived and had children.
Right. No, it's a beautiful, beautiful section. Again, it's one of my favorites in the whole series, and it was a wonderful thing to cut and put together, because of you know, because most people don't know the whole story. They don't know that he helped her get to the hospital. You know, they don't know that she survived. They don't know that she moved to Canada and became a mother herself. And finding the stock footage, I didn't realize there was stock footage of that event, you know, when the napalm came down, and that there was a newsreel cameraman who caught the little girl running up the road, you know, in real time. And so to be able to intercut the stock footage with the photographs was, again, a great gift, to expand on the storytelling in that regard. You know, one of the shots that amazes me is kind of a long shot where I think I show the village from a distance and the smoke coming up, and then there was a long shot where the newsreel cameraman caught the little girl and the family starting to run up towards where the photographer was, and so that you could see her from a distance first, and then cut, you know, to the close. I think that's when I did cut to the actual famous photograph. And then after that, cut to the newsreel where you see them all trying to help her. It was a great find, you know, that it was part of outtakes. I mean, it was the newsreel story that was on the national networks didn't include that long shot. But again, our stock footage archival researchers they really dug deep. They tried to find outtakes of all of these key events in the war to see what else was available to be able to create the sequences, which gave us a whole lot more material to work with.
You know, during the production of the film, when Lynn Novick, the co-director, and Sarah Botstein, the producer, were out here on the West Coast to do interviews, and they came to our house one night. I think we had dinner. And as they spoke about what they'd been doing, and it became clear that they were having, you know, secondhand PTSD. Yeah. It was the wrenching emotions that these people were going through, giving these interviews, sometimes telling stories that they had kept bottled up for all of these years. It was, you know, it's just kind of such a hard road to go down, and I'm sure to some extent that was true for everyone involved, especially everyone who lived through that war. So y'all have done really just a great service.
Oh, thanks. It was really hard. I mean, like I said, it was, you know, it was all happening when I was a young man, and it was affecting us deeply at the time. And to have to kind of live through it all over again by watching that footage over and over again was not an easy thing by any means. You know, and again, as an editor, you have to watch it. You know, you work on one sequence. You know, like the sequence of the little girl who was napalmed. I mean, it took me days really to work it out and put it together. So you're watching that over and over and over again, and it does become very difficult. You know, you do have to get up and actually go outside for a little bit and come back. You know, it's. But again, it's just, you know, thinking about the desire to want to let people see what really happened and to tell the real story of what happened, and to let that sink in and affect them in terms of these moments of American history. I mean, I think it's really important. I mean, we just can't. Again, one of the great gifts of working with Ken is this combination of filmmaking and history for me, because I feel like people really need to know their history, you know, backwards and forwards, upside and down, and not forget it. I remember all the good things, but remember all the mistakes that were made, to help us avoid making mistakes in the future. You know, it's for some reason historical events seem to fade away in people's memories so quickly, you know, that you just want them to be reminded of them constantly. You know, remember what happened then. Let's not do this again, please. You know,
I was thinking about that not only is Ken Burns the kind of the epitome of, you know, chronicling what defines America and the American experience, but his documentary art form is maybe a uniquely American way of digesting history.
Yeah.
You know, it's you know, it's not fast food, it's not a Swanson's dinner, but it is ready made, and it's, you know, it's the whole feast is laid out for you in such an entertaining and interesting way.
Yeah,
it really is such a maybe uniquely American way of learning history. I don't know, but
yeah,
he's
well,
certainly quite a niche.
But the key to it with Ken and his work, and he speaks about this, is that what interests him is not really the facts and figures of history, but it's the emotional archaeology. It's like when he digs into the past, he wants to find the emotional kernel of what was going on in those people's lives at that time during those events. And that if he can capture, and if we can portray that kernel of emotion that those people were going through, then it's going to sink into people watching it now in a much stronger way. You tend to remember emotional moments more than you remember facts and figures, because it hits you. It hits you in your heart, hits you in your soul, it hits you in your brain. And then it has a real strength to it that's going to stick. And I think that's the key to why his films are so effective in telling history, because it does hit the heart, and these people come alive, and you feel like you're there and you're witnessing it and you're feeling it as much as the people who are doing it at the moment. You know, I mean, you can't help but feel the emotion of those soldiers who threw their medals over the fence on the steps of Congress, and how betrayed they felt, you know, by their country, and being asked to, you know, fight this ridiculous war for what reason, you know. It just the way I think we did the sequences, it just hits you like gangbusters.
Yeah.
It becomes unforgettable.
And sometimes so quietly. There's the one sequence with the guy, I forget his name, who went into exile in Canada, and he's
Yes.
talking about hearing the news about his various friends who had died, and
Yeah.
he asks, why? And as he's saying that, you fade to black. We're
Yeah.
hearing the why over the black, and it's just, oh.
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, I mean, you just use all those little cinematic tricks to make the emotion, you know, hammer home.
Mm.
That's what we constantly are trying to do.
Right.
One question that came to mind, I'm just curious to know, you know, we're in the age of you know, celebrity chefs and celebrity news commentators and pundits. I'm wondering if, you know, being in the age, this phenomenon of celebrity documentarian, Ken Burns and Errol Morris and Frederick Weissman and Alex Gibney and others, in your opinion, has that been a good thing for the documentary business?
Oh, I absolutely think so. I mean, it's, you know, again, thinking back to the 60s and 70s when I was first coming up in the film world, there were so many not that many documentary feature film releases at all in those days. It was very, very rare. And then even on the networks, without cable, you had the 3 networks, and it was like, trying to get NBC to do a documentary about some social issue was like pulling teeth. So the expansion of the world of documentary in both the feature film world and in cable television is wonderful, I think. I mean, I'm loving it. I'm glad that there's celebrity documentarians who are well known by name, and that people have an interest in watching these nonfiction films as much as they have an interest in watching fiction. Again, it's just that there's so much going on in the world that can be discussed and talked about in a film. And I do think that, people these days are, they're reluctant to read. So if you want an important subject to be, more widespread in the American public, doing a documentary about it is perhaps a better way to reach an audience than writing a book, unfortunately. I hate to say that, but it's true. And I really do wish that more people would read. And part of the impetus of Ken making this, we know the limitations of what we do. There's a certain kind of shallowness to the delivery of history that is in our films, and it has to do with the film form and time limitations and not being able to go as deep or not being able to analyze quite as much at such great depth. And that's why for Ken, the emotional story has to be paramount. Let's leave the analysis to the books. But that's kind of the downside of what it is that we do, that sometimes you can't go into quite the detail that you'd like to. But still, it's it's a way to get it across, and we always hope that watching our films will actually get people interested in picking up some books and reading more about it.
Yeah, I just think they're so rich and so beautifully done on every level, just every level. It's just fantastic.
Yeah, no, it was a great gig. I lucked out.
That's great.
So Paul Barnes, thank you so much for spending this time with us, for sharing your wisdom on the art of documentary film. And can we get you to promise to come back and talk about fiction film? Because I know you also speak very eloquently and insightfully about fiction film.
Certainly, I'd love to. Anytime. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for joining us on the Filmosophers Movie Talk Show. Please subscribe to stay up to date on our newest episodes.